and welcome to Spotlights. This is the podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. And as usual, I'm your host, Sam Mickey. And this week, I'm really happy to welcome onto the podcast, Chad Barron. Chad, thanks for making time for us.
Of course. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat with you. You're the co-founder of a new organization called Degrowth, California. And so I want to talk a lot about degrowth with you. And of course, we know each other. We've worked together a little bit. You did a master's degree at the University of San Francisco, and I had the good fortune of being your thesis advisor, talking about degrowth, which isn't something I'm an expert in. It was really the other half of your thesis that I came into, which was its intersection with Catholic social teaching. And so really interesting work, and I think pretty groundbreaking. So I'm happy to chat with you more about it. Degrowth has come up a few times on the podcast, just a little bit. Especially, I would kind of instigate and be like, "So is this the degrowth kind of thing?" And but we haven't gotten into the details of it. So I'm excited to chat with you more about that. I guess first, I always like hearing people's kind of origin story, the autobiography, because it's not intuitive for a lot of people to care about something like environmental and social work, and which people think that's more about activism. It's about policy, science driven, but then also doing faith-based work. And of course, that's the Forum on Religion and Ecology is all about that intersection.
Mm-hmm.
And so, how did that come about for you?
Yeah, no, it's a long story, but essentially, I was working in the education space, and I was working in nonprofits for quite a bit, very much community facing work. And I was witnessing, all of these terrible injustices and trying to do my best along with others that I was working with and the community at large to address these issues. And I just got super frustrated. I was like, dang, there seems to be underlying causes going on. And I wanted to know more about those underlying causes. So that propelled me to graduate school, and in graduate school, our advisors guided us and told us, we would love it if the work you do is somewhat novel. So part of their guidance was to read through the literature you're interested in and see what gaps there are and how you might be able to fill those gaps. And I came across degrowth pretty early on at USF. And I was super intrigued and captivated by the message and the perspective. And it seemed to articulate well for me a lot of the kind of frustration I was feeling toward, the systemic causes of these various injustices I was encountering. So I wanted to center that. And I was also brought up in the Catholic faith tradition. So I had some background with Catholic social teaching generally, and had a light bulb moment, essentially. I think it was the end of my first semester at USF, where I was reading an article by Roberto Puglioni outlining the affinities, essentially, of degrowth and the thought of Pope Francis. And, in my mind, there seemed to be quite a bit of overlap. I guess I felt that kind of intuitively, or having been engaged with Catholic thought for a while. And I thought I might best contribute, by bringing wider Catholic social thought into the conversation with degrowth. And so, yeah, that's kind of how I came to the thesis project, essentially.
Yeah, and that's when they got a hold of me. They're like, "Oh, this is a weird intersection here. We need a religion guy to get involved." And which was just a treat. And the international studies program there is a really cool program. Great people, great faculty, great students. So it was really, really a pleasure to work on that with you. And I learned a lot in the process, and definitely kind of had my own light bulb moment of thinking, degrowth. This is the way. And it's very triggering to a lot of people. And there was a piece that came out in the journal Nature recently, and by some of the main degrowth authors. It was, I don't know, like half a dozen people contributing to this piece. Mm. And Jason Hickel was kind of the lead author, I think, and then a handful of other folks. and the online kind of firestorm around it. People get so mad when you say degrowth. They're like, no, we need more growth. Degrowth, we're all gonna die, and it just seems like you're going to destroy civilization with this. So so what is it? What's degrowth? That's I want to get into that and then talk about how it intersects with Catholic social teaching. But first and foremost, what is this term? What's this movement?
Yeah. So, I mean, the term itself goes all the way back to I think it was like the 1970s, and it was really this question of whether economic growth can last within a finite planet. And so the term was first used by Andre Gores, who is a philosopher, and it was used in 1972, I believe, just asking that question: Can we have is degrowth necessary in order to foster an economic system that functions sustainably within planetary boundaries? That's not a direct quote, by the way, but and so it was essentially this critique of growth, economic growth, as a process initially, but it's become more complex, and now there's this ideological component which essentially critiques the ideology of growth, conflating growth with progress and well-being. And to me, that's a really interesting component of the term nowadays, because I mean, ever since I really engaged with that thread, I see it everywhere. Just
Mm,
take APEC, for example, in San Francisco recently. Much of the rhetoric was around how do we foster healthy economic growth that brings everyone into the fold, essentially. Which I mean, that's been said for decades, and yet we're still struggling to foster a more, I guess, widely beneficial system for everyone. But and lastly, I would say degrowth is also a vision. So not only is it a critique of these two, sort of facets of growth, but it's also, I think it offers a vision of one, how do we get to a sustainable system? And what does it look like in the end? You know,
right.
so yeah, it's taken on quite a lot uh, recently.
Nice. Yeah, that's a good summary. And it seems to make sense to me that you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet.
Right.
And but of course, people push back on that, and they're like, "Well, but as we grow, we'll leave the dirty phase of growth behind. We'll have cleaner growth." And so it's always uh, kind of juxtaposed against green growth, sustainable growth.
So,
And so there's all this pushback that the solutions to the problems of modern economic development is more modern economic development,
yeah.
and that doesn't make sense to me. But obviously, people who've really bought into these ideas are like, no, that's because that's what a healthy economy is. You have to grow. So if you're not growing and but are in fact in some kind of degrowth, how does that not hurt the economy? For the people out there who are like, no, you need to grow. We need to build more things. We need to increase development, more jobs, all that kind of stuff. How is what would you say to those folks who are like, no, you're gonna hurt the economy, you're gonna hurt people's personal well-being, social welfare, it's all gonna go down.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, so that question comes up a lot. If we encounter a degrowth scenario, it's just going to cause a recession
Yeah,
and people are going to be hurt by it. But that's kind of introducing, policy within a current system that demands economic growth, right? So it's really a call to restructure how the economy functions, um, and uh, in that restructuring, we can have processes whereby we decrease our material footprint, and while I think facilitating greater well-being for people and planet. Um, and so, for example, maybe we can talk about this perhaps a little more in depth a little later on, but a common thread within the degrowth literature is the need for a more just distribution of resources in order to uh, foster, a system that functions within planetary boundaries, but also facilitates access to the things that are necessary to live well within society. So yeah, it's of course that question is going to keep coming up for the foreseeable future for sure. But it's essentially a matter of restructuring the economy itself so that when we introduce policy that is geared towards reining in our consumption of resources, it wouldn't cause this sort of collapse.
Right. And I know part of this is just a matter of metrics. And because right now, gross domestic product is how people measure the health of an economy.
Right.
And so are we just going to get rid of that as a metric or restructure that?
Well, I think so. I think get rid of GDP as a metric of progress and well-being, certainly. Um, there have been other metrics proposed, like the genuine progress indicator, that better encapsulates, what living well looks like, and it encapsulates, the individual, the collective, but also the environmental requirements for living well. And so GDP has been steadily rising for decades, and it suggests progress, right? It suggests that people are living better, healthier lives, which of course is not the case, and certainly not the case in the United States, where we have the highest GDP out of any nation on the planet. Yet we're terribly behind when it comes to education. We're terribly behind when it comes to life expectancy. So I think it's obvious that GDP is not a sufficient metric of well-being or progress. And there is a need to, I think, bring to the fore other metrics that, yeah, that incorporate a wide array of indices.
Yeah, it's a tough one because if you're a U.S. citizen and you only really pay attention to what the United States says about itself, we're the happiest and best and most successful country that the universe has ever seen.
Right.
And when you actually start looking at like life expectancy and education and things like that, you're like, oh, we're not doing too good. And there's some kind of thing where it's like, well, of course you need to have a certain amount of economic development to have people healthy and happy. And then something happens where you have more growth, but the happiness isn't correlated with it, and it stays the same or even declines. So I know like countries like Bhutan with gross national happiness, and like, well, in terms of GDP, they're not doing as well as the United States. But in terms of things like happiness, people are doing well. I know the idea of things like a 4-day work week instead of 5-day work week, things like that. And I think most people are like, that sounds nice. How is that going to hurt society? I'd get more time with my friends and family.
Totally. Yeah. And the 4-day week point is a good one. I think it's something that I think cuts through the fog, because people hear degrowth and they're like, oh no, bad. But you introduce, I mean, we advocate for a 4-day work week. Like, you'd have more leisure time, you'd have more time to allocate towards creative outlets, time toward family, and then people are like, oh, that sounds pretty nice. And within that too, of course, is the issue of distribution of resources. So it's not necessarily to have a 4-day work week, but you're also going to take a pay cut. It's how do we maintain, you know, a, just income and wealth distribution within, this kind of framework of a society where we're not, encouraged to continually produce more and more.
Right. Yeah, because I think that's the thing. People are like, sure, 4-day work week. That means you have a 20% reduction in your salary. You're like, oh. So yeah, a lot of it is, a change in distribution. Um, and, so that means that some of the people who have too much are going to need to give to people who maybe don't have so much. And which sounds like socialism and communism, and that frightens a lot of people, especially in the United States, especially lately, where the word communism is being thrown around a lot about just about anything. And I know there's been some work on degrowth communism, where people are rereading Marx and interpreting him and lining him up with degrowth. But it seems also that when it comes out of like France and Europe, that it wasn't socialist, but more like social democracy. So is degrowth compatible with like a democratic way of life?
Oh, totally. I mean, that's I at least from the, I guess, more influential uh, works that have come out on degrowth lately, democracy is certainly a priority. Any degrowth scenario needs to happen democratically. And so, I mean, I think, you know, that's the route we have to take, of course. And degrowth, from what I can tell, advocates that for that wholeheartedly. And it's interesting, just the point about communism. Um, Jason Hickel, one of, I think, the leading scholars in degrowth right now, I can't remember where he mentions this, but kind of engaging in this concern about communism, he highlights that, well, the communist states that occurred in the past, they were not actually anything different than, the Western capitalist states, other than it was a state sponsored capitalism that was
Right.
bent on economic growth. So yeah, I think yeah, future degrowth scenario processes, it has to happen democratically. But again, I think if we really bring to the fore the actual policy that, would have to we would have to pursue and undertake in order to get to a degrowth scenario, I think it's actually far more attractive than might first meet the eye.
Yeah, that's a really helpful point. Like, we'll look at, the USSR or look at China, like they're very much into productivism, it's industrial growth all the way, just not through free markets.
Right.
Yeah. Well, then people are like, wait, so this is even worse than communism because it's going to be we're not going to grow as much food. And people are like, but growing, that's what agriculture does. And it's like, well, we're not talking about the same kind of growth. We'll still
Right.
have food.
Right. Totally. I mean, we're not, well, I think Monsanto changed their name recently.
Right.
A colleague of mine pointed out, I was just like, oh, how convenient,
Yeah.
kind of avoid these lawsuits or whatever. But yeah, so it's not, Monsanto, or what was Monsanto, they had a growth incentive to produce more and more of these kind of chemical intensive fertilizers, right?
Yeah.
But degrowth would say, hey, we need to try and like discern what technology is helpful and what's not, and grow the technology that is helpful in our current circumstance, and have the freedom to rein in the technology that is leading to various forms of environmental stress. So that's a perspective of degrowth that I find quite refreshing. And you, Professor Zenner, were talking about the new term that Pope Francis coined recently. Which, can you remind me of the term?
What, integral ecology?
No, 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 no.
Or
In Laudato Deum, technocratic.
oh, right, the technocratic paradigm.
Yes. So I
Yeah.
mean, we've given free license to technology
Yeah.
today, right? To do what technology does, advance, and ostensibly be for the benefit of society as a whole. But obviously, without the parameters, some ethical parameters, it goes awry.
Hmm.
And so the perspective from degrowth that I find particularly refreshing is this call to discern well what is helpful and what is not.
Yeah. And then in like for agriculture, for instance, that means there's less chemical agriculture, less, genetically modified organisms. And then you have uh, more nutritionally dense food and
Right.
more sustainable production of food. So you actually are able to feed the world and just cutting out all the really wasteful and harmful technologies that we currently are using to try to feed the world.
Right. Definitely.
And I know a big part of degrowth also is that we're trying to get a big output because we want food for everybody, education for everybody, healthcare for everybody. But if you cut out the waste in production, the material throughput, you can actually maintain a high output.
Right. Definitely. I mean, there seems to be the term artificial scarcity, you know,
Right.
is thrown around a lot. And there is the perspective of degrowth is that there is uh, more than enough resources to provide provide for the well-being of everyone. And it's just a matter of how do we more intentionally and effectively allocate these resources. So another point, kind of along this thread is a phrase is thrown around quite a bit in degrowth circles is kind of shifting from private luxury to private or shifting from private luxury to public luxury, essentially. So kind of cutting, you know, putting proper parameters around private wealth in order to provide for more public services and encouraging against austerity measures, for example.
Right.
So, yeah.
Such an important point because it's one of the things I always hear from people who seem like they're intentionally not reading the actual degrowth literature, but they're like, "That's just austerity measures. That's what you're doing." Like, no, we explicitly said that's not what we're doing.
Right, right.
Well, one other thing I definitely have to ask you about, because this is another objection you always hear, is people will point out the inequities of asking the United States to degrow is one thing. Are you going to go and tell the global South to degrow because they still need some development? Water, sanitation, hospitals, and some of the basics are still not really present in some places. And so, how do you deal with the global North, global South kind of imbalance?
Right, totally. And I mean, this is actually a really good place to bring Catholic social teaching into the conversation because Pope Francis, I he doesn't ever explicitly use the word degrowth, but he's got to be engaged, with the wider discourse, and I'm sure he's come across it because it seems too, you know, the symmetry seems too perfect. So he perhaps unintentionally articulates a very important point in degrowth of degrowth in Laudato Si, where uh, Pope Francis states essentially that there needs to be decreased production and consumption, I believe, in the higher consuming nations of the world, while the less consuming, less wealthy nations of the world have the space essentially to grow in the way that they need. And that's exactly the point of degrowth. Degrowth argues that those places, those countries that are disproportionately contributing to um, ecological collapse essentially need to rein in what they're doing. They need to rein in their economies. Um, and degrowth recognizes the kind of neo-colonial dimensions of this, where the historically uh, colonized areas of the world are bearing the brunt of the climate crisis and having to deal with the more accentuated uh, uh, um, issues.
Yeah.
So yeah, that symmetry was quite apparent to me.
Yeah, and yeah, I really wonder if Pope Francis has heard the term degrowth. I would imagine him or all of the advisors that are working with him, somebody must know it and must know that they should probably keep that word out of some official documents
True.
because he's just
Yeah.
going to trigger people. He's already very unpopular with conservative Catholics in the United
Right.
States
Right.
who are just like, he's not the real Pope and all kinds of things like that. So yeah, he's very savvy with the way he frames things. I think one of the toughest things about degrowth is it's kind of a bad frame because it is a negative word. It's
Right.
degrowth, and so that just confuses people right off the bat.
Right.
And it's like, well, it's a certain type of growth we're talking about. But yeah, this is a good time then to transition to talk more about Catholic social teaching and how that fits in. I don't know if that's come up on the podcast ever to really, like we've talked, like you mentioned, Christiana Zenner came on to talk about Laudate Deum, and she has a book on water crises called Just Water, where she gets into Catholic social teaching, talking about water issues. And so we've talked about it a little, but I don't think we've ever defined it. Because I'm sure some of the viewers or listeners have maybe heard the term, but especially people not familiar with Catholicism, maybe have never even heard the term. I think even plenty of Catholics might not have heard the term or might not know what it is. So give us a little rundown. What's Catholic social teaching?
Yeah. So Catholic social teaching, my understanding is essentially it's the more authoritative texts coming out of Rome, kind of articulating the church's position on various social issues, and this might be encyclicals, apostolic exhortations. I don't know if this is appropriate. I think it is, but I incorporate the catechism into that, and there's a compendium of the social doctrine of the church as well. So those were the documents from which I really sourced a lot of my information from on my thesis, and it's definitely, I think, more authoritative than what might be categorized as Catholic social thought, which is more general kind of rumination, non-official, documents that center Catholic teaching as it pertains to social issues.
Nice, very helpful. Well, and you mentioned how some of the stuff Pope Francis has been saying, critiquing the technocratic paradigm and consumerism, how that lines up. What are some of the principles from Catholic social teaching that you found to line up pretty clearly with degrowth?
So I what I found really interesting is there has been a critique of growth from a Catholic social teaching perspective for quite some time. And from what I can tell, it was from at least, it started at least in the 1970s with Pope Paul VI. So he actually, in an address to the UN, stated that economic growth, technological progress, if it doesn't operate within certain moral parameters, his words were, it's going to uh, go against man. It's essentially going to turn on us and become destructive. And he formalized this position within Catholic social teaching, I think the following year with, I'm terrible with the Latin names, but Octogesima Adveniens. So in this paperwork, this critique of growth was kind of formalized. And of course, Pope Francis takes it a step further and says, in certain parts of the world, we actually need decreased growth. So it appears to me this critique of growth is grounded in Catholic social teaching, and even more strongly, there's this call to decrease growth. But there's certainly others. The both degrowth and Catholic social teaching articulate that the non-human world, essentially ecological processes, these things have inherent value, and that it's not simply this value that comes from what the non-human world and ecological processes can do for economic growth. So obviously within the current system, they're only valued as such, right? Like how can they contribute to GDP? You brought up Bhutan earlier. I believe it was the World Bank. They just tweeted something that I found quite comical. They were critiquing Bhutan for not utilizing more of their vast forests, saying it only contributes to 2% of the GDP. They need to do more. And that just illustration, I think, is perfect for me, because it's like, oh yeah, within this framework, forests don't mean anything,
Yeah.
right? If it's not contributing to GDP growth. But I mean, how many people, I can't really speak for Bhutan because I've never been there, but I'm assuming that within their gross national happiness index, they value the forests in a different way than GDP. So I think that's a helpful starting point when bringing the two together into dialogue, degrowth and Catholic social teaching. There is this grounding sort of value that the non-human world and ecological processes have inherent value, and there needs to be this reciprocal, family-like, as Pope Francis, I think, words it, relationship, and not one of just pure utility.
Yeah, I mean that seems so obvious, and I think it's so important to be able to frame it in terms of Catholic social teaching, because other people are going to hear degrowth and they're like, "This just sounds like environmentalists or social justice activists or something," and it's like, no, it's actually rooted in a faith tradition. It's not just us coming at it. It's not just hippies complaining about the man destroying forests.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And I think this also ties well into degrowth and Catholic social teaching's perspective on well-being. So within the current system, GDP is conflated with well-being, and the idea is essentially that our well-being will increase if GDP increases, if production increases, if consumption increases, and Pope Francis is clearly, frustrated by that in Laudato Si, and I'm sure with his newest work. And degrowth is equally frustrated. No, well-being is far more complicated than merely consuming certain goods and producing certain goods and growing the economy. And um, so another thing I find refreshing within the degrowth literature is this centering of those other things that are not necessarily contributing to economic growth that are essential for well-being, like genuine, authentic relationships with community members, neighbors, having the time and space to invest in creative outlets, to invest in family. So many of the things that are not within the purview of GDP, we need to bring back into into the forefront of our minds, into the forefront of how we relate to each other, and ground them, in economics.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think of how early Christian communities, like those first few centuries after Jesus, it was very much about sharing, not about private property at all. And the idea that it's turned into something so different, and contemporary Christians, I think, have really forgotten some of the basics of what was very common to early Christians.
Oh, totally. And I mean, so this was a point of interest for me because pretty heavy in the literature of degrowth is the idea of commoning, right? So, like, bringing into democratic control those resources upon which everyone depends. Um, and that was kind of like not necessarily a red flag for me, but I was like, oh, geez, this might be a point of significant tension between degrowth and Catholic social teaching. Let's look at this a little bit closer. Um, and you know, within Catholic social teaching, there is this quote unquote natural right to private property, and but I think it's important to one define what is private property, and two, look at it through the lens of universal destination of goods.
Right.
So degrowth wouldn't necessarily argue that we should abandon all personal property, right? These, your car, your maybe less cars, but it's not saying like you have to give your car away. Uh, your home, your kitchen utensils, whatever. Um, Private property is essentially the private ownership of the means of production, the things upon which goods and services are produced. Like this would include land, water, and so Catholic social teaching, it's a little foggy when it comes to the position on private property. But as you brought up, when you look at the patristics, when you look at the early church, there was a clear call to abandon not only private property, but personal property.
Mhm.
Um, uh, uh, I'm trying to think of some of the key figures. I think it was Saint Justin. I'm forgetting the second part of his name, but
Justin
um,
the martyr.
yes, I
Yeah.
believe so. He said, I think there was a charitable component to it, right? Like uh, the uh, taking care of those most, I think, marginalized in your society, that has to be centered in any approach to wealth, income, etc. But it was seen this issue of private property and personal property was seen through an eschatological lens, right? So they were anticipating the second coming of Jesus to occur, I think sooner rather than later, and they said, well, if that's the case, we have no use for these items. We have no use for owning things individually. Let's bring it into the collective. So it was seen through eschatological lens, but I think it's pretty informative nonetheless on the approach of Catholic social teaching towards private property. And of course, more recently, with the idea of the universal destination of goods, Saint Pope John Paul II actually states that this quote unquote natural right to private property follows it is less important than the universal destination of goods. And so, in the current crisis we find ourselves in today, that encompasses the whole globe, I think this theme of Catholic social teaching is quite relevant in how we organize and how we utilize resources that uh, the whole planet depends on. Um, so yeah, it's even more relevant today.
Right. Yeah. Increasingly. And I know when we were talking about some of the main tenets of degrowth, you mentioned how a big one is making sure that there's a more fair distribution of resources, and that definitely fits in with the universal destination of goods. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about Catholic social teaching on what justice means in terms of distribution.
Yeah, I think it's really justice entails adequately providing for individuals to flourish, but within a community that is flourishing, right? So what is essentially necessary to live well? And when we consider the intersection of social issues and environmental issues, justice entails uh, facilitating greater well-being for the environment. And so, you know, when we're looking at it from the lens of Catholic social teaching, subsidiarity comes up, and within degrowth as well, there's this theme of localization. And it's paradoxical, right, that in this time of global crises, we're kind of drawn to look more local. And subsidiarity, I think, offers a great avenue to really explore what justice means for individuals and communities. What is it in our communities that help facilitate well-being, and what are the resources that we have at our disposal to better provide for the well-being of individuals and the community at large. And I think ultimately justice is found through that kind of deep reflection. And I think it's it's encouraged certainly by Catholic social teaching to be reflective and intentional with these issues, because it's nuanced, it's complex, and every context is different. But there's this kind of, I think, global call to reflection, and yeah, hopefully we can chart a more just path uh, as a result of this collective reflection.
Yeah. Yeah, subsidiarity, I think, is such a profound concept because a lot of times, if you meet people who are like into localism, that often just means I'm going to live on my land and practice self-sufficiency and subsistence and not interact with the wider world.
Right.
And whereas subsidiarity, I mean, the Catholic Church obviously is not that. It's definitely a global organization
Right.
and very hierarchical, but with this idea that it's the local first, right? And that you
Right.
start with the local and build up from there. So it's not rejecting globalization. It's definitely rejecting the dominant form of it now, which is technocratic, but would replace that with a kind of grassroots globalization where every
Right.
community can kind of do its thing, but in this larger network. So we're still
Right.
interacting with other communities. There's still international trade and things like that, and international governance and agreements. So I don't know. I find that very hopeful and really solves a big problem because I know some people who are localists who are just localists, and they're like, I have my farm and my family, and everybody else get off my land, kind of thing,
Right.
which basically turns into a kind of libertarianism.
Right. Yeah, no, I think it, it's quite clear within Catholic social teaching too. I think it's in the Catechism where it states this, that there is uh, it is appropriate in certain cases to have, higher tier governing bodies, you know, maybe stepping in and helping guide certain processes. Um, so there's not this, yeah, there's no rejection of, yeah, national governments or international organizations kind of helping facilitate uh, international relationship.
Yeah, which is so important when we have global environmental problems like climate change. Like we're gonna need some, something just beyond local communities hashing it out for themselves.
Right. And I mean, I haven't, this is a point of curiosity from my end. I would love to read more about Degrowth's perspective on what is required when it comes to international cooperation, because there has to be, it has to be done. Uh, there has to be a collective shift, and it has to be done together, communicating with each other, and making sure that we're all on the same page, because it's a vast undertaking. It's a big undertaking, and hopefully it's as organized as possible. Otherwise, we might degrow as a result of external factors
Right.
forcing us to, rather than willingly, democratically. Um,
Right.
and Mother Earth might just say, "It's just time that y'all degrow." Yeah, I gave you enough time to figure it out.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, that's the forced degrowth is not that wouldn't that wouldn't look so pretty.
Right.
And yeah, when you think of like migration and things like that, like we have more humans migrating around the planet than ever before. So we're going to need a lot of international cooperation to facilitate this in the most peaceful and just way possible.
Right.
Not easy, but helpful to know also that this implies that there's not one size fits all degrowth. It's going to
Yeah.
look different in different places, in different countries, different communities.
Oh, definitely. And the other thing I'll say when it comes to the question of distributive justice, in the compendium of the social doctrine of the church, it explicitly states that the well-being of a country needs to uh, incorporate, or the well-being of country needs to be seen at least in part through the perspective of distributive justice. So how are countries doing when it comes to a just uh, distribution of the collective wealth, of income, uh, and obviously the United States, I think more than ever before, has increasingly uh, an increasing wealth disparity and income disparity. Um, so yeah, I think so much is kind of going underneath the rug right now in our society, where, if we held the light up to the economy and really looked at uh, the patterns that are prevalent today, we would be like, oh my gosh, this is just, we get a
Yeah.
failing grade.
Yeah.
It's just, it's crazy. So,
Yeah. Yeah, I saw something recently that was looking at wealth disparity in the United States over the last like 30 years. And it was something like 30 years ago, the top 1% of the wealthiest Americans had something like 20% of the wealth. And the 50% majority had like half the wealth. And gradually, that middle class, the 50% wealthiest Americans, have gradually had their wealth taken from them, and the 1% has climbed. And we've now hit a point where the 1% actually own about half the wealth in the country. They own as much as the 50%.
hmm.
So just in 30 years, and
Yeah,
somehow people aren't just freaking out about this. Yeah, I mean, you're right. We've done a good job of sweeping that under the rug and just be like, oh, things are good. Look at our GDP climbing.
right. Yeah, and who's capturing, the fruits of the GDP, quote unquote, fruits of the GDP. But yeah, and it's not like we haven't railed it in before or reined it in before, right?
Yeah,
Like in the I think it was 60s or 70s, about there were policies that better facilitated just distribution of wealth in the United States, and income and wealth disparity was far lower than it is today. And so when these sorts of ideas and concerns are forwarded, a lot of people think, oh, it's just not American for to even question that.
yeah,
Well, I mean, we have in the past,
yeah,
and we've been far better when it comes to this particular metric in the past. So why can't we today, you know, try and make progress towards a more uh, equitable society?
yeah.
Like, it seems American to do so.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. And I think maybe a lot changed in the 80s when people just redefined what it means to be American. And then all of a sudden, the real Americans are all about, like, nope, that's the vast majority of the history of this country had much more income equality and less wealth disparity. So it's staggering how short people's memories are. And they just
Right.
define American in terms of what they've remember from the last couple decades.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, important point because obviously talking about Catholic social teaching as it relates to degrowth, Catholic social teaching doesn't have that big of a hold on the American imagination,
Mhm.
and America is one of the toughest countries to encourage to practice degrowth. So it's good to be thinking like, how do we frame this in a way that appeals to American values?
Right. Totally. Yeah. And I mean, I think there is, when we look at, the core principles of Catholic social teaching, and if we could just focus on that and not even frame it as Catholic social teaching, I think there would be just agreement, resounding agreement. And who knows, maybe I'm completely naive when it comes to this, but also, if you do just want to be explicitly Catholic about it, Catholicism is, from the global perspective, is still the largest Christian denomination in the world. So
Yeah,
there is still quite a bit of influence
yeah,
today. And in the United States, I'm not sure what the numbers are, but there's a significant Catholic population in the United
yeah,
States today as well. So I think Catholic social teaching has an important role to play in encouraging, this rumination within Catholic communities, of course, but as we see with this conversation about degrowth and Catholic social teaching has a lot to offer when it comes to fostering metrics, fostering moral parameters that uh, we can utilize when we think about the economy and how it functions,
yeah,
so that this economy, which is a tool working for humanity and
yeah.
not vice versa, right? So I think, yeah, there's definitely a place for Catholic social teaching in the broader discourse.
Yeah. Yeah, right. I mean, a billion Catholics are on the planet. That's a pretty substantial amount of people. It's like if
Right.
they can all get on the same page about that, be a massive source of moral transformation and social transformation. And yeah, and it's the point that like the economy is supposed to be working for humans, not humans working for the economy. It's such a simple Christian point. Jesus saying, "Man wasn't made for the law was made for man."
Right.
And so yeah, so it's just reminding people, hey, that faith that you're into, take a second look at that
Yeah.
and maybe prioritize that over like the technocratic consumerist society that we're living in. So in a way, it's a small ask because you're just asking people to embrace a happier lifestyle.
Mhm.
Um,
Right.
well, along those lines, you're out there making this happen because you have this new organization. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about Degrowth California and how that's fitting in with some of the other organizations around the country, around the world, because it's the movement's definitely picking up a lot of speed lately.
Right, definitely. So Degrowth California, we're about 8 or 9 months old at this point, and we're still organizing. We're still, tightening some screws, and but it's the work we've been doing so far is primarily presentation based. So uh, the degrowth is becoming a more common term utilized in the broader discourse in the United States. And so I think there's a lot of interest in just learning what degrowth is about. Uh, uh, you know, just this kind of general introduction. And so, yeah, we've been asked quite a bit to provide introductory presentations, and I'm appreciative of this conversation because we're able to dive more into the nitty gritty and have more focused conversation. But yeah, I think right now it's just a matter of introducing the concept. What is degrowth? Don't be scared. Let's talk about this. We're all in this together. We have to try and figure it out. Um, and yeah, it's an exciting time in the United States because this conversation regarding kind of degrowth or post growth approaches in general it's just starting in the United States, but they've been having this conversation for quite some time in Europe. Maybe not to this grand scale, but maybe not to a grand scale, but they've been having it nonetheless. And I think we're slightly behind slightly behind Europe when it comes to this. So yeah, and there are other degrowth organizations. I think there are a couple. Another hub would be I think Vermont. Vermont has a degrowth group, and um, we're trying to formalize degrowth US, which kind of would just act as kind of this umbrella organization, facilitating dialogue and collaboration between everyone pursuing degrowth in the US. Um, and we're attached to also, I think, a broader international movement, um, and a degrowth international group actually just, I think, formalized
Hmm.
this past year. So there's a lot happening. But aside from degrowth specific things, there's a lot happening in various countries too, in regions. For example, in Brussels in 2023, there was a Beyond Growth conference
Hmm.
where a significant number of community stakeholders and political leaders gathered to discuss uh, what a post-growth economy can look like. And there was this clear sort of frustration with the harmful emphasis of GDP growth. And so to me, that was quite uh, uh, important and exciting because you're having politicians engage more seriously with this concern of GDP growth and welcoming other voices into the conversation about what a healthy economic framework can look like. And um, the Prime Minister of Ireland actually
Hmm.
said explicitly that we need to rethink this obsession with GDP growth. And there are a number of other countries as well doing making important shifts in that direction as well. But I guess my point is that post growth, degrowth perspectives, as scary as it can seem at first, they're I think it's far more reasonable and commonsensical now to engage with these kind of perspectives, and it might just be absolutely necessary. Um, so it's encouraging to see the progress that's being made.
Yeah, no, that's very encouraging. And it's one of those things, the work I do with so much environmental stuff, a lot of times I'll get asked what gives me hope because it's such dark kind of stuff to study.
Right.
And degrowth is one of those things. I'm like, well, this isn't just a couple books or something. It's a social movement and it's increasingly growing internationally. And it promises to find a way through all of our problems in a way where we're actually happier. That somehow giving up the society we have now won't mean we don't have things. It won't mean that we don't have healthcare or food or housing. Like, no, we'll actually have more abundance, and we have to move away from this artificial scarcity that we're currently manufacturing. And so, like, we can get through this and be happier. And so it's a very promising movement, and the fact that it's faith based, it means you have a simple language to communicate to people all around the world. You don't have to get into the nuances of economics and policy. Just remind people, like, well, all these traditions we have, they encourage us to share and live a simple life, and that you can
Right.
really find happiness that way.
Yeah. And degrowth isn't necessarily faith based, but
Right.
uh, yeah, but I think there is so much overlap between various faith traditions and degrowth that it degrowth can act as an outlet, for these uh, people of faith and to actually contribute to sustainable transformations.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And yeah, it's so important to be able to frame things differently depending upon the audience. And then when you're talking to people who don't want to hear about faith, okay, we'll just talk economics and policy.
Right, right.
And then for people who are like, look, I don't know about all this economic and policy stuff. Can you just explain it in terms of some faith-based values? And we can do that as well. So yeah, it works for everybody. Um, well, this has just been great. Should let you go because I try and keep things around an hour, but we could definitely chat about this a lot longer, and I know we will in the future.
Yeah.
But thanks for coming on and explaining all this stuff. I hope people enjoyed listening or viewing it, or however they're consuming the podcast. Because I just think it's one of the most important things for people to get educated on these days, especially because the green growth people are very good at kind of misinterpreting what degrowth is. So there's all this kind of negative propaganda out there. So I appreciate the way you kind of the way you explained it and the way you're lining up with Catholic social teaching. Just all really fun stuff.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you having me on. This was fantastic.
Yeah, looking forward to doing it again sometime. And and I know we're working on an article together, so I'll have to have you back on once we get that written and published, and we can chat about it a little more.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Cool. Well, Chad Barron, thank you so much. This was really a treat, and thanks to everybody for tuning in. We'll be back with some more conversations for you soon. In the meantime, take care and be well.